Welcome to Echoes Past, where we journey through time to hear directly from the silent witnesses of history. Today, our guest is truly extraordinary, an icon of leadership, a steadfast presence in the heart of American power. We're speaking with the Resolute Desk, currently residing in the Oval Office of the White House. For over a century, it has served presidents, borne the weight of momentous decisions, and absorbed the echoes of history. Today, we've asked it to share its unique recollections of one of humanity's most perilous moments, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Resolute Desk, thank you for allowing us this unprecedented conversation. Before we delve into those 13 days that shook the world, could you share a little about your own history? Your own origins are quite unique.
Sure thing. My story's a bit different. I wasn't made from trees in the usual way. I came from a ship. The HMS Resolute, a British explorer ship. That ship had quite a journey, eventually abandoned in Arctic ice in 1854, only to be found adrift 1,200 miles away by American whalers a year later, and then finally returned to Queen Victoria. When the ship was retired in 1879, the Queen had 4 desks made from its timbers of white oak and mahogany. I was the largest one, weighing in at 1,300 pounds and given as a gift to President Rutherford B. Hayes in 1880 as a symbol of friendship between the two nations. I've been around for a lot of presidents, in different spots. You might know, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had a panel put on my front, the modesty panel, to cover his leg braces. But it was Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy who found me in the White House broadcast room in '61. She had me brought here to the Oval Office for President Kennedy. That's when things got really serious for me, right in the center of it all, just as the Cold War was heating up.
That is quite a story. Before we get to the crisis itself, could you set the scene? What was the atmosphere in the country like in those early 1960s regarding the Soviet Union? And what was your impression of the president?
President Kennedy. He had a lot of energy, a quick mind. You could tell he wanted to make his mark. But the country's mood then? In the early 60s, it was all about the Cold War. This wasn't a shooting war in the traditional sense, but a global standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. Democracy versus communism. Each side convinced the other was a threat to its very existence. And both sides had nuclear weapons, enough to wipe each other out many times over. That was the backdrop for everything. In America, there was a real fear of communism, of Soviet power. People had duck-and-cover drills in schools. Some built fallout shelters. There was this constant low hum of anxiety about what the Soviets might do next. Every international incident, every Soviet move, was seen through that Cold War lens. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in '61, meant to oust Castro in Cuba, had been a real blow to American prestige, and to Kennedy personally. His summit in Vienna with the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, ended in mutual distrust between the two leaders and a hardening of Cold War positions. Khrushchev was a tough, often unpredictable character, and he really tested Kennedy. So leading up to Quota 62, there was this feeling that things were fragile, that any spark could set off something big. Cuba, so close and allied with Moscow, was always a flashpoint. I could sense tension building between the two countries.
Take us to October 16th, 1962. How did the crisis begin from your vantage point here in the Oval Office, and how was it initially handled with the press and public?
That day, October 16th, the mood changed like a spotlight pointing at a dark room. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy came in, face like a stone. Then the photos were spread out right here on my surface. U-2 spy plane images, no mistaking them. Soviet missile sites being built in Cuba, pointed straight at America. I saw Kennedy go still, absorbing it. Shock, then a flash of anger, then this heavy, serious understanding. The room went quiet. Then it was all urgent, hushed talk. Phones rang off the hook. Advisors were in and out. For the first few days, it was top secret. The president knew that if word got out before he had a plan, there'd be panic and political pressure for immediate, maybe rash, action. So the press, Congress, the public, were kept in the dark, while a special group of top advisors were pulled together into what would become known as the Executive Committee, or ExComm. It was a room of immense experience and pressure, with men like Robert Kennedy, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, CIA Director John McCone, and General Maxwell Taylor. They were meeting constantly, trying to figure out what to do. The options discussed in those first hours were all grim: invade Cuba, bomb the sites, a naval blockade, or try to negotiate with nuclear war as the alternative. The pressure cooker was on, instantly.
You mentioned ExComm. President Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, was the Attorney General and a key member. What was his role in these discussions?
Bobby Kennedy was more than just the Attorney General. He was the president's most trusted confidant. In those ExComm meetings, or when the president brought the core of the debate back here to me, Bobby was a vital presence. He wasn't a military strategist or a seasoned diplomat in the traditional sense, but he had an incredible ability to cut through the noise, to ask the tough questions. I recall him challenging the military's assumptions, particularly the certainty that airstrikes would be clean or that an invasion wouldn't escalate. He was very concerned about the moral implications. I remember him likening a surprise U.S. airstrike on Cuba to Pearl Harbor, and that carried a lot of weight in this office. He pushed hard for understanding Khrushchev's position, for finding ways to give the Soviets an out without humiliation, which he knew could make them even more dangerous. He was often a voice of caution, but also a relentless interrogator of every option, ensuring no stone was left unturned. He wasn't afraid to disagree, even with the generals, and the president clearly valued that unfiltered counsel. He was instrumental in guiding the ExComm toward a more measured, yet firm, response.
The world held its breath for those 13 days. You mentioned the quarantine. Can you describe what that physically entailed? The rules of engagement for the Navy, and what happened as the Soviet ships headed towards that line?
The quarantine, as President Kennedy carefully called it, a blockade is technically an act of war, was a line drawn in the ocean. On October 22nd, he announced it to the world.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
The U.S. Navy deployed a massive force, something like 180 ships, forming an arc around Cuba, initially 800 miles out, then pulled in to 500 miles to give the Soviets more time to react. Their job was to intercept any ship heading to Cuba and inspect it for offensive weapons. The rules of engagement, I saw them being drafted and redrafted right here, were crucial. They were trying to be firm but avoid an accidental war. The orders for the Navy were precise. U.S. vessels were to hail any approaching Soviet or bloc ship by radio and signal. They were to request it identify itself, its cargo, and its destination, and to state it must not proceed to Cuba with offensive weapons. If a ship refused to stop or provide information, the plan was to board and search it. If it resisted boarding or tried to run the quarantine, only then was minimal force authorized. First, a warning shot across the bow. Then, if absolutely necessary, non-lethal shots to disable the rudder or propellers to stop the vessel. Direct firing on the ship itself or its crew was to be an absolute last resort, ideally only if they were fired upon first. Every effort was stressed to avoid casualties and an uncontrollable escalation. The real test came around October 24th. Reports flooded in. Soviet ships, some clearly freighters, others with unknown cargo, were approaching that quarantine line. The tension in this office, you could have cut it with a knife. President Kennedy was here, getting constant updates. Would they stop? Would they challenge the line and those rules of engagement? I felt the immense strain. Then, word came. The first few Soviet ships closest to the line, they stopped. Some were tankers, or carried cargo that wasn't on the prohibited list, and after communication, they were allowed to proceed carefully. But other Soviet ships, the ones suspected of carrying more missiles or critical offensive gear, either stopped dead in the water or actually turned around. I remember Secretary of State Dean Rusk saying something quiet but intense to National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy right around then, something like, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. That was a huge moment, a tiny bit of the pressure releasing, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot.
Indeed, the crisis escalated further, particularly on what became known as Black Saturday, October 27th. What happened?
Black Saturday. That day felt like standing on a trap door with the hinge about to break. The news came in. An American U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson had been shot down over Cuba by a Soviet SAM missile. He was killed and became the first and only combat fatality of the crisis. The military advisors in ExComm, especially the Joint Chiefs, felt they now had a justification to strike, demanding immediate retaliation against the SAM sites. The pressure on Kennedy to strike back was immense. It felt like we were one button press away from a shooting war. And with that U-2 downing, the U.S. military went to DEFCON 2. That's the defense readiness condition, and DEFCON 2 is the step right before nuclear war. DEFCON 1 is war itself. So DEFCON 2 meant American strategic bombers loaded with nuclear weapons were in the air, on alert, ready to strike targets in the Soviet Union on a moment's notice. ICBMs were fueled and targeted. The entire military was on its highest operational footing, short of actually launching an attack. The world had never been this close. The tension I felt here, reflected in the grim faces and urgent whispers, was mirrored globally. Everyone knew what was at stake. And if that wasn't enough, at almost the same time, we were getting frantic reports from the quarantine line. A Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine, the B-59, had been detected deep underwater, trying to get past the blockade. U.S. Navy ships were using practice depth charges to try and force it to surface, trying to signal it while not attacking it, but the submarine crew was cut off from Moscow and didn't necessarily know that. The conditions inside those old subs were unbearable. Sweltering heat, cramped, and low on air. It became known much later that the captain of that submarine, Valentin Savitsky, under immense stress and believing war might have already started, actually ordered the preparation of a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Its target, the flagship of the American fleet, the aircraft carrier USS Randolph. The standard Soviet protocol for launching that weapon required the consent of two senior officers, the captain and the political officer. But, by a sheer twist of fate, the B-59 operated under a different rule. As the flotilla's flagship, it had a third key officer aboard, Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla chief of staff, and its protocol uniquely required the unanimous agreement of all three men to launch. In this case, Captain Savitsky and the political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, reportedly agreed to arm the torpedo. However, the third key officer, Vasily Arkhipov, equal in rank to the captain, vehemently disagreed. He argued against it, questioning whether they were truly under attack or if the depth charges were signals. It was Arkhipov's staunch refusal and his ability to calm the situation that single-handedly prevented the launch of the nuclear torpedo, an act that would have undoubtedly triggered a catastrophic nuclear exchange and the beginning of World War III, resulting in millions of deaths. We didn't know just how close that decision was, the details of Arkhipov's heroism, until decades later, but the raw tension of a Soviet sub being forced to surface while a U-2 pilot lay dead. This office was a pressure cooker. Nuclear war felt terrifyingly possible.
It's frightening to learn that the world was saved from nuclear war by one man's decision, deep beneath the waves, isolated from the world. A man whose name most of us never even knew. While these intense deliberations and near catastrophes were happening, what was the mood like in the country, and how did the press react once the news broke earlier in the week?
For those first few days after the missiles were discovered, the secret was held incredibly tight. But once President Kennedy went on television on the evening of October 22nd, laid out the evidence, and announced the quarantine, it was like a dam broke. The mood in the country, from what I gathered through the president's briefings and the news summaries he reviewed, was deep, widespread fear. People understood what nuclear war meant. There were reports of people flocking to grocery stores, some even trying to build makeshift fallout shelters. Those duck-and-cover drills in schools suddenly felt very real. The press reaction was immediate and intense. Headlines were huge, stark. Every news broadcast led with the crisis. There was a lot of speculation, naturally, and the administration was trying to project calm resolve, but the sheer gravity of the situation, the possibility of nuclear war, was conveyed very clearly. The press, I think, reflected and probably amplified the nation's anxiety, but also the general rallying behind the president once the threat was known. After the U-2 was shot down on Black Saturday, the calls for strong action in the papers and from some politicians became even louder.
With tensions at their absolute peak, how was a resolution found? You mentioned Robert Kennedy earlier. What was his role in these critical negotiations?
As Black Saturday wore on and the world teetered, the back channels became even more critical. Khrushchev had sent 2 letters. The first on Friday was more rambling, emotional, offering to remove the missiles if the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba. The second, which arrived Saturday morning after the U-2 was shot down, was much tougher, demanding the U.S. also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. ExComm was divided on how to respond. It was Robert Kennedy who championed the idea, sometimes called the trollop ploy, of essentially ignoring the second harsher letter and responding only to the terms of the first, more conciliatory one. But everyone knew the Turkey missiles were a sticking point for Khrushchev. So on that Saturday evening, October 27th, with the president's full backing, Robert Kennedy undertook a secret, incredibly high-stakes meeting with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin at the Soviet Embassy. I didn't see that meeting, of course, but I saw the president before Bobby left, the weight of what he was asking his brother to do. And I saw him when Bobby returned, reporting what happened. Bobby had reiterated the U.S. demand for missile removal and the non-invasion pledge. Crucially, he also conveyed an understanding, a verbal assurance, not a formal public agreement, that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which were largely obsolete anyway and already slated for eventual removal, would indeed be taken out within a reasonable time after the Cuban crisis was resolved. But this had to remain a secret. A public quid pro quo on Turkey would have fractured NATO and made it look like Kennedy caved under Soviet threats. Dobrynin understood the delicacy. It was this secret understanding, conveyed through that personal, high-stakes channel, that provided Khrushchev with the assurance he needed to order the withdrawal of the missiles from Cuba, while being able to claim he had secured Cuba from invasion and achieved a major concession for his side.
It's almost unimaginable. How did it feel from your perspective when a resolution was finally reached after all that?
The relief, when it finally came late on October 27th and into the 28th, wasn't like a sudden party. It was more like the whole world had been wound up like a spring, tighter and tighter, and then, slowly, it began to unwind. It was huge, but quiet, almost solemn in this office. The deal involved Khrushchev agreeing, publicly, to dismantle the missiles in Cuba under UN observation, and the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba. The secret part, the one that really helped Khrushchev save face and agree, was the U.S. also committing to remove its older Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy a few months down the line. Robert Kennedy's private assurance to Ambassador Dobrynin was key to that. I saw the president after it was all settled. Those 13 days had definitely taken a toll, made him look older. But there was also a new kind of authority about him, a seriousness that comes from looking into the abyss and finding a way back. The public relief when it was announced was overwhelming. You could feel that wave of gratitude even here. One very concrete thing that came out of it was the hotline, that direct teletype link between Washington and Moscow, so leaders could communicate instantly in a crisis and hopefully avoid another slide towards disaster due to misunderstanding or delay. If I learned anything from it all, it was how quickly things can escalate when superpowers are suspicious of each other, but also that even when you're staring catastrophe in the face, strong, careful leadership and a willingness to find common ground can pull you back. It showed that talking, really talking, even with your toughest adversary, is essential. I won't ever forget those days. It was a close call. Too close.
Resolute Desk, your account has given us an extraordinary and sobering glimpse into one of history's most critical moments, especially highlighting those crucial secret negotiations. To have felt the weight of those decisions, the tension in this very room, is a perspective only you could offer. Thank you for sharing your recollections with Echoes Past. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a timeless reminder of the stakes of global leadership and the razor's edge upon which peace can sometimes rest. Hearing it from the Resolute Desk adds a layer of intimacy to this monumental event. Join us next time on Echoes Past as we continue to uncover the stories held by the silent witnesses of our history.